Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through one story and one story alone. And it has to pertain to what the legacy that Joe Biden is leaving. What damage has he done? What has he done well? What can we look forward to from his time in office and looking into the future, the repercussions, and what do we have to worry about? And of course, we will end today with our daily delight. We still want to leave you feeling positive and ready to take on the day at the end of this episode, even though we will be talking about some more dreary stuff. So, daily debate. If you are to give Joe Biden a grade of A to F, which are you giving him? Throw your opinions down in the comments section. With that said, let's actually jump in to the first thing that I want to talk about, which I think are the positives. What did Joe Biden actually do well? I don't agree with all of the separate programs that were put in to any of his, CHIPS Act, or when he was trying to put through Build Back Better, all these different omnibus packages. We can talk about the fact with the CHIPS Act, which I think is probably one of the better acts if you're a person who likes seeing strategic industries actually get a little bit of a bump. When it comes to chip manufacturing, in the United States, we no longer have Intel, who actually manufactures a lot of the chips here. They outsource it to other countries, such as China or TSMC in Taiwan. Intel used to be one of the greatest chip producers. Now they actually are a great chip designer, and even then, you could argue they're not the best chip designer, especially when you have multimodal sort of problems that need to be fixed by not necessarily CPUs anymore, but GPUs, and that's why NVIDIA is having its day in the sun. But my point being that Intel, they spend a lot of time designing chips now, and they send them off to be manufactured other places. So we've lost those sort of jobs. So maybe in the future, when we have an economy that is so reliant on chips, which it already is now, but it's only going to continue to be that way as we move into the quote-unquote Internet of Things. We have smart devices everywhere. We have mobile processing units when it comes to just data filtration on our faces. Think of, Meta glasses, AR glasses as they come in. They're going to need very efficient and small, powerful chips. That is obviously going to be powered by places like Taiwan, where they have some of the most advanced semiconductor production in the world. So if you want to bring some of that back to the United States, doing strategic partnerships with companies like TSMC, they're building a new plant in Arizona, and a lot of these jobs, some of them are going to be for Taiwanese people, but a lot of them are going to be for American workers. That was actually hashed out in the deal itself, and that was what made some of the funding, there was a requirement for some of the funding for that project. And we're trying to build out our own market here. Though the chips that will be made there are technically a generation behind the latest stuff that they're building in Taiwan, it's still allowing us to build up that strategic infrastructure. And moving into a time when we're going to have to focus on it more, it's actually a good thing. Some of the other protections that in some of the bills, while I don't necessarily love unions and the way they have a stranglehold, especially on public sector unions, no doubt about that, but the way that they have strangleholds over companies, I do appreciate when Joe Biden says that we need to actually support the mentorship programs that our unions are so famous for, especially in some of these industries where we're trying to build up our manufacturing again. And in some of these harder industries where we've lost so many jobs and people are realizing there's actually a great opportunity to go into some of these skilled trades. So he actually put an addendum in one of the bills that said that the money that was going towards different companies and unions had to be put towards these apprenticeship programs. And though they're not perfect, and though I feel as though you shouldn't be directly handing money to unions or companies and those sort of subsidies, if we're going to live in a world where that's going to happen anyway, that feels like a relatively good use of money because it's actually going to increase the productivity of those citizens and of the economy as a whole, which if you're going to fall into the category of you need to use government spending to actually increase the GDP, and this is a better way to do it than just simply subsidizing products, but rather actually improving the skill set of people and making the people more productive so they can go out and create more goods. That would be the basic idea behind the education system. And though I don't love the education system either, the basic idea there is that though we're taking on the burden as the public, we are actually making the next generation smarter, in theory. Now, we've seen declining test scores, especially after COVID time, that may raise that question. But the idea there is that you're not just pumping money into things in order to prop up industries, but rather you are creating a system that allows those industries to flourish without making them completely reliant on government money, which is a better way to do it, which is actually, if you're going to have a viewpoint of government as sustaining the people, helping improve their lives, that's one way to do it without necessarily just giving them handouts, but rather by getting them to live up to their potential or trying to evoke the best out of them. So those sort of things were good. There are plenty of other things where you could say he did an okay job when he was talking about the railroad, when he shut down the railroad strike. A lot of unions don't like that, but at the end of the day, he stood in as president and said, we can't stand this sort of gridlock. There are other policies, China tariffs, he did an okay job on. Some of his strategic policies about allowing companies to sell to China, all these different manufacturers of the products that go into semiconductors and chips, or even the equipment. Like in the Netherlands has one of the largest chip producing manufacturing machine companies. So they have the machines that are actually able to do the fine, tiny work that is necessary in order to make some of these chips. They put restrictions on even those companies. So not just chip manufacturers themselves, but also higher up the supply chain. They put restrictions on them being able to sell to China in order to limit their strategic capability of building out this infrastructure in the chip market. Because one, we don't want them to rival Taiwan, but two, we don't want them to overtake us. So those sort of things, even though in principle, I'm not necessarily for going against the free market, if I'm going to let my national security side come out here, especially when it comes to China, if you've been listening for a while, you know I'm pretty hawkish on China, then I think there is an acceptable middle ground there where I could actually defend it between my two principles, and I feel like it's something that was actually good. Now, let's move on to the things that weren't so good. What did Biden really mess up? One, I would say the stature of the United States on the international scale, on a international scale. What do you think about when you see an 80-some-year-old man who is in the condition Biden is in, representing us on the world? Whether it be when he's with the G7 nations and he's falling asleep at the conference in Europe, whether it be the way that he deals with threats like Putin to our allies, not necessarily to the United States, but Putin standing up to Putin. Was he doing it in a vigorous way that actually inspired a sense of confidence in you, or maybe possibly even put fear into the heart of Vladimir Putin? No. Do you feel confident when he's dealing with Hamas and Israel on an international scale? Do you feel confident that he and Janet Yellen are strong enough people to push back against China and not let them roll all over them? Basically just, push them down and then stampede. I don't know. I would say that in general, his posture on the international stage has been relatively conciliatory. And while I understand that's actually a coherent type of diplomacy theory, that doesn't mean I agree with it. So maybe I could say the same thing about anybody who has the same theory of diplomacy. But you could have that theory of diplomacy and still be a strong figure who's able to stand up for what you believe in and inspire confidence in the people that vote for you, but also inspire fear or a projected image of strength with your allies and enemies that you're dealing with on an international stage. I don't think that he is able to couple those two things together. Even if I don't agree with his diplomacy politics, that doesn't mean that diplomacy politics can't have some strong values. I don't think he is able to actually bring those strong values out of it based on his quote-unquote posture. And not his literal posture, of course, but his figurative posture. What else? He was over the nation while COVID was going on, and he kept the restrictions on too long. We can't ever forget about that. I'm sure most of us want to memory hole the years of 2020 to 2022, but COVID restrictions were still in place in lots of different places until 2022. Biden had a hard time saying that we actually want to get over this part of our history. Though he did at one point come out while he was on that factory floor and say, oh, COVID's over, and he stopped wearing his mask. He was the president that brought us out of COVID. I think you could have made an argument that COVID was over a year before, especially in lots of different jurisdictions across the United States, and he could have been much more lax, especially when it came down to using the CDC the CDC and OSHA in order to try to force vax mandates on people. I think you can really take a second to think about it. Is that the proper purview of a president? To force his people into doing something that is not necessary and do it in a second, or how should I say, a distance nature, rather than simply saying there will be a mandate like he did for the federal government, or for federal agencies that were under the executive branch. He has the power to do that, especially in concert with Congress. But when it comes to second-handedly using OSHA to say that this is some sort of safety issue, which, fair enough, you can make an argument for a safety issue, but trying to force this down on private companies, I understand pulling federal funding in order to get what you want. That's a normal tool and mechanism to actually for the federal government to use in order to get their way with people. And while I still think it's heavy-handed and it's bad, you could say that's a normal thing that's precedented, whether or not you like it. Using OSHA as a mechanism to implement your political will on people is I don't want to say dictatorial, but it is definitely so unprecedented and so second-handed in the way that they wanted to go about it, that it really inspired a sense of angst in me when I first heard about this policy coming out from OSHA. So that's, of course, the surface level stuff. But the article I have today is from the Washington Examiner, and they bring up some very specific points that I want to go through. So, right here, quote, leave the damage Biden has done to the U.S., the mass immigrant influx, the decline in the standard of living for millions of people, and the chaos abroad for another day. Right now, a new analysis shows the damage Biden has done to his party, and it is immense. This is very important to actually look at. You may be saying, well, hey, Alex, you've said that you've never really been a fan of all the elements of the parties. You've never really been a fan of the Democratic Party outright. You come up and say things when you think they're doing things that are right, but for the most part, you've mostly lambasted them, and hey, fair enough. That is indeed true. But the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, whether or not I like the directions that they're going in, right now they are the quintessential part of American politics. And if you weaken a party so much that you leave room for a more extreme party to be born of it, aka a really far leftist movement, I think that maybe you should actually really consider this in historical terms. For many, many years, we have been learning, or at least I have been learning, and I'm sure you throughout your college, high school years, or even as an adult have been learning about how parties dissolve and they're weakened by movements, elections, or failing leaders. And the more radical elements, or even different elements, they don't necessarily have to be more radical, see opportunities within that moment of weakness in order to rise. So the degradation of the Democratic Party may leave room for a more outwardly populist/socialist sort of a Democratic Socialists of America in order to rise in the ranks of the Democrats and possibly be the next ruling party on that side of the aisle. And while you may not think that's the end of the world if you are a Democratic Socialist or you're someone who believes in those sort of things, for somebody who doesn't necessarily believe in a centralized government, especially when it comes to the economic operating field in the United States, doesn't like a centralized economy, that does scare me a little bit. Quote, exit polls show that in the 2024 presidential election, 35% of voters identified as Republicans, while 34% identified as independents and 31% identified as Democrats. In addition to a big jump in the number of self-identified independents, the news is that in 2024, Democrats slipped to the third place in the party ID, end quote. Now, once again, this doesn't actually mean anything concrete. This does not mean that the Bernie Sanders and the AOCs of the party are going to be able to go away and craft their own special left-wing political party and come back and sweep in the midterms. And also, them actually changing the direction of the party and possibly going in that more leftist direction actually requires the party to do some inspection, to look inward for a little bit and understand why they failed and come to a very specific conclusion, which is we were not populist on these issues. We weren't leftist enough. So a lot of variables have to fall right, because honestly, I think that this party will not look that internally. They will just go along as business as normal. They'll say it is a Trump phenomenon sort of thing. We can't necessarily change it on our end. It's not our fault that this happened. It's not our fault that the deck fell this direction, so on and so forth. And fair enough, they could very well come to that conclusion, but the fact that the party is so damaged that they would have to do introspection, and I'm saying this as an outsider, saying if the Republican Party lost as badly as they did with the hopes that they had for Donald Trump, I would hope there was some inspection, there was some inward looking, but no, there probably wouldn't have been. It probably would have been business as normal. It's always hard to admit when you lose, but the point being, I hope the Democratic Party does the exact same thing, and I hope they come to the conclusion that maybe they need to moderate, not go the other direction. But we know that politics isn't going to be that way at all. But let's actually read the next sentence, because I think it really encapsulates how much of a big change this is. Quote, "For the first time since the Watergate era, independents surpassed one of the major political parties to rank second in terms of party identification," writes Republican pollster David Winston, who has just finished an in-depth study of the election results. Quote, "In this presidential election, the percentage of the electorate that self-identified as Democrat came in behind independents. This means that in this election, Democrats are de facto more a third party than a dominant party in the electorate." So the next question that this raises is, okay, is there room for a third way party? Is there room for a libertarian party in the middle here? Is there a room for a completely independent party that they just call themselves the independent party? Could the Greens take advantage of this? I don't know. I don't think the people in the middle actually are politically informed enough. And that's not to say that they're not politically informed, but normally a lot of people, especially in our generation, when I run into an independent, they're more of a person who doesn't necessarily follow politics. Or they're the inverse. They're someone who follows politics passionately, but they don't want to necessarily come down on one side or the other. And both of those personality types, people that don't necessarily follow politics or the people that follow politics but don't want to come down on a side, if you create an official third party that's called the independent party, the first person is probably not going to know enough to feel confident joining, and the second person that I mentioned is not going to want to come down on a side, even if it is the quote-unquote independent side. So they would say, I'm a moderate now, or I wouldn't fall into the independent category. So I don't know if there is potential here, but the fact that the door is open is a legacy of Joe Biden. It is something that he leaves behind because of his terrible handling of the immigration crisis. It is something that he leaves behind because when everybody looks at the terrible economy, they think Joe Biden. They think of the inflation underneath his term. They think about the fact that they can't afford houses, that groceries have gone up, that childcare alone has also gone up. They look at him and they see a Democratic Party that doesn't fight for them anymore. And that is why when Trump says, I'm fighting for you, when he says, I'm going to fight for the average American, I'm going to try to bring jobs back here, even if a lot of it is talking points, and even if the actual end result of his policy will not be that, he is at least saying the right things. And he has captured the zeitgeist of the moment, which is Americans feel as though America is falling and somebody needs to put America back on top. And when you go from a Trump presidency to a Biden presidency, when you go from a Republican, a new age Republican, versus a old age Democrat, literally old age, but also metaphorically in the way that he approaches politics and some of his policies, you get to see the contrast. The American people got to see the contrast between the two. And if the Democrats don't play this right, it could stick. It could be more than just a momentary thing. There's already a whole bunch of Gen Z that is locked into the Democratic Party no matter what. There's a whole bunch of the Gen Z that's already locked into the Republican Party no matter what. For a lot of the people that are a little bit older, not the ones that are so old that they've locked in again, but the people that have been able to see the transition of the parties throughout the course of their life, probably hitting their 30s, 40s, and maybe going 50s. And I think after that, you get mostly solidified on where you've been, or you're just an independent for the whole time and you care more about specific issues. But there's enough people there that there is a shift going on. And I think a lot of those people are looking at the modern Democratic Party, and if option like a Bernie Sanders comes up, that could gain momentum, but also if a third way party comes up, I think that could gain momentum. This is a moment where the Democrats need to be very careful how they proceed, and I don't think they're going to do enough introspection in order to see that movement, but if it happens, they have to handle it very, very carefully, and that is courtesy of Joe Biden's time in office and the people around him. Don't get me wrong, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, all of them play into it as well, but he will be put at the top of it because he was the leader of the party at this time. So, with all that said, let's jump into our daily delight. I think we've talked about his legacy, especially when it comes to foreign policy, some of the good things, some of the bad things, but more importantly, the really undertone here is the possible change within the Democratic Party, and that could be his biggest legacy that he leaves behind, a party that is broken and dilapidated and not ready to move forward. Whether they do introspection or not is up to them, but if they do, we could see a very, very different political system. And I say system, the system won't change too much, but a different political party structure within, I would say, the next 10 years. So with that said, let's jump into our daily delight. And this one is coming from our friends over at Animals Around the Globe. The headline reads, "The adorable spider that can befriend and remember people." Now, this is a jumping spider. So if you've ever seen jumping spiders in person, they pounce, don't get me wrong, and it can be a little bit intimidating to some people, but these close-up shots of them on all different types of materials, plants, are absolutely adorable. If you don't like spiders, maybe you won't love this one, but honestly, I think that they are some pretty cute animals, and also it's pretty fascinating, some of the facts that are in here as well. So if you want to read that article, or you want to read the other article from today, the Washington Examiner article, both of them will be in the link in the description below the like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the episode of the Twitter tirade over at the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip. And if you stick around here on Tuesday and Thursday, what you'll see come up on the RSS feed and the YouTube channel is 6 and 6. 6 stories from around the world. It's international news, and it's under 6 minutes. So if you want to hear that, stick around or subscribe on the RSS feed. With all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.